introduce this panel was, the title for this panel is courtesy Dr. Anant Maringanti. This was originally two separate panels, one on identity and exclusion and the other one on police violence. Both of them were combined, and then yesterday when all of us, when we all sat together and talked about all of these things, lots of interesting things emerged, as Anant would say. All kinds of interesting things emerged. And that's what we hope to initiate some conversation in light of what was a very excellent day that referred to a lot of things yesterday. We are also missing Meera Sangamitra, who we would have liked to have with us in this discussion, but is currently fighting bigger battles elsewhere. We are in solidarity with her and all those others who are fighting for us. Chandan.
Thank you, Manish. I'll take the easy route. I'll be the moderator for this discussion. I don't know about Manish or Tashi, but I'm not an expert on fear or happiness, so I'll just kind of, work around it. But, so I just wanted to start with the theme of those in 2019, which is the incomplete, be it the incomplete city, be it the incomplete family, be it the incomplete archive. And I sort of, being an anthropologist, I can't help but start with a kind of allied concept that we have in anthropology called partial truth, right? That it's always revealing itself. So no matter how much we go and try and find data, that data is always incomplete in the sense that it is completing itself in another space and time. Also, the idea of the incomplete archive, right? And why is the archive incomplete? Now, when the archive started to formulate itself in the way we know it, which is in the textual English script, there has been work done around how the officers would try and collect speech that would imply that people are compliant and complacent with British authority, right? So one of the things of the archive is then that it acts like a ventriloquist, that it speaks on behalf of somebody, right? Now, when we speak about fear, when we speak about self-censorship in some senses, how does that kind of create an incomplete archive, right? Yesterday we spoke about hidden and absent data. So, in this case, what is the reason for it being hidden? What is the reason for it being absent? How does fear and the need to be complacent kind of figure in the way the archive is kind of structured? It's interesting because here I have the sacred and the secular, and I sort of kind of mediate in between. But it would be interesting to begin with Tashi and how does the sacred or how does religion kind of grapple with the idea of fear? Like how do we see fear through a religious lens? If I could kind of start with that question.
I think in the title, Happy New Fear, fear is not really new, I think. It's a very, very old tool and experience for everyone. I think almost every being on this planet, I think. But the new thing probably would be in this regime and this government is they're asking us to find happiness in being fearful. And they are trying to teach us how you need to be happy, being afraid and frightened and threatened and scared, all kind of scenarios in everyday reality, I think. So that's in some sense new, I think, for most of us, at least for our generations, for younger generations, in that sense. In religion, of course, fear is a favorite topic for all of us, I think, most of us religions, I think. Certainly in Buddhism, so I think, in a sense, because Buddha talks about suffering and the idea of wanting to be liberated from suffering also comes from the idea that you need to be afraid of suffering. You need to be fearful of suffering, right? And so there is a fear in religion at the basis of it. Like you want to become either a Buddha because you're afraid of suffering, or you're afraid of suffering for yourself and for every other being, In other religions, you want to become one with a god or anything because you're certainly afraid of being by yourself in your own reality, in your own existence. So fear is the basic, one of the basic core of most of the faiths, I think. But in some sense, the fear what we have right now with our state or with our government, our mechanisms right now in play, could be different from at least the philosophical aspect of fear in religion, I think, because there is some kind of rational to that fear because there is some way ahead of that fear. Like you see, it tells you about things that you need to be afraid of, but also it tells you how to get away from those things. But I think outside that space, the fear that we experience now, they do tell you that these are the things that you need to be afraid of, but also there is no way out of them. You need to live in the fear, and you need to learn to live in the fear. And more or less in the practical everyday reality, of course, most of the religions have also become that, like teaching how to live in the fear, not to have to become free of fear, but teaching to how to live in the fear, I think. So that's both state does and both religion does in a very nice mutual, partnership, I think.
Right. So that's an interesting point which you made about the fear of suffering, and that then sort of brings us into looking at suffering as a punishment, right? And so, I mean, one thing, Manish, is that if you look at law, the law always is preemptive and it's punitive. That you're supposed to be scared of the punishment. So, is fear then implicit in law? Like, does law come with that territory in the first place?
I think it does. I think it does, and this actually manifests itself in very interesting ways. So one is the idea of law as law as a command, which has some sanction for its violation, right? And people and the expectation is that people will comply because they're afraid of the penalty, right? So like traffic fines are increased, so we expect that there'll be more order on the street because of that. There is also fear within the law itself, and fear that comes, I think, from a very fundamental way of state-citizen relationship within the law, right? So, and I'll give an example. So, when we were, when I was growing up, my parents and teachers and other people used to use this phrase, I'll take you to the police station, as a threat against against some egregious kind of misbehavior, right? It was used loosely, but over the years, I think that created a mindset in all of us, and this is true of like many other of many people that I know, where we grew up fearful of the police, right? So our immediate reaction, our relationship with authority was one of fear. For me then later I studied law, and I had opportunity to interact with the police, like as a law student, as a lawyer, as an activist in many forms, and I think that fear went away and was replaced by other things. But for a lot of people, I think even today, the predominant relationship with the police, and I'm specifically referring to the police because when you talk of law and law enforcement, the first thing that comes to mind is the police as an institution, as a presence, and as as you have these reassuring boards all over Hyderabad telling you, Hyderabad Police's logo says duty, respect, and compassion. Right? The first two I get, the third, yeah. So that is essentially driven. So the relationship between the law and the citizen is mediated through fear, and this fear is very manifest, I think, from a very early age in in the police. The other thing also, I think, is that many of us, and especially those of us who come from different kinds of marginalization, fear becomes, fear is something that stays with us throughout our interactions with the state, because we're always conscious of how the state and the law are looking at us, are looking at our bodies. And this is where I come to the idea of discipline that you mentioned. Because for the state to deal with its citizens, the discipline becomes, I think, one primary metric of controlling and of managing the population. And discipline extends to the way that, like, the way people speak, we walk, the way we are dressed, as our Prime Minister recently said. So I think all of these things come together in that relationship between the law and the citizen.
I mean, when you mentioned that the whole idea of discipline and you create these docile bodies, I mean, obviously, something which kind of interesting I recall is looking at the way in which the museum actually evolved in Europe, in the 19th century, where, I mean, you have to kind of enter the museum and view the artifacts, but at the same time, you are in this public space and the architecture is such that even you are being viewed, So the museum is also where, as you being in the public or your location in the public is where then you start to self-censor yourself. You start to behaving in a certain sense because while you're looking back at the artifacts are also looking back at you or the viewers are looking back at you, So it is said that the museum is where the first space where one begins to practice being a citizen, where you discipline your body in a certain sense, you walk in a certain way, you enter one gallery or another, be geographically or be in a certain timeline. Of course, in the museum, the biggest artifact that is actually there is the nation state, because it's telling you this is how you have come about, This is the narrative that's sort of being told. But, I mean, one thing which I think, and this is where I want to bring in Tashi here, is that this internalization of discipline, like how do we understand that? Like how does the body kind of react to that?
Before
You had to eat lunch right now, So I'm sort of,
Yeah, I need to eat lunch before 12 at the best possible, I think. But yeah, before we get into that, because the police was brought in, I remember reading in one of the police stations in both Gaya, they have an abbreviation of police, and the P stands for Purushard. And I was like, I didn't want to really go down to read what the rest of the abbreviation was, I think. I was like, done over there. P is Purushard, and police are basically trying to tell the entire Gaya people like how to attain Purushard, I think. How to be disciplined and how to live in that discipline to attain Purushard, I think. When in my experience of interacting with police and the self-censorship, like as a visibly Buddhist monastic in Bodh Gaya, it goes two ways. One is the way where I'm constantly in fear because I need to always, whenever I interact with police, that I need to really prove them that I am an Indian citizen, because they all think I'm Tibetan, because there are hardly any Indians who are Tibetan Buddhist monastics. They refuse to believe I'm Indian. And I need to really prove them that I'm Indian. Then if I successfully get to the point where they make them believe that I'm Indian, then the second question comes that, oh, then you converted to Buddhism. Why? So then the hostile questioning begins around that, why did you take up Buddhism, why not Hinduism? So do I prove that I'm Indian, or do I just give up saying that, oh, I'm not Indian, I'm Tibetan, I've just learned Hindi and Telugu and I speak? I do not know. I mean, and it is kind of, in a sense, censorship with me, because I need to be careful because I live with a community. Whatever I do and engage with rest of the police over there or government officials comes back to the community that I live with. It is not just with me. Or similarly, when I was working with, like I remember when when I was working with Hyderabad queer community, all dharnas would happen back then at least, would be Dharna Chowk, Indira Park. So when we do dharnas in Indira Park, of course, we need to apply for permission, so-called permission. We need to get the permission and everything. And there used to be this local inspector over there. He would very hesitantly give permission. Of course, we get the permission from ACP or DCP, whoever, and then the local police come, watch over that we are in time and we are coming on time, leaving on time, all that. And so this inspector would, after every dharna is done, of course, in the first dharna, he took my number and he would every now and then message asking, let's go for a movie, let's go for dinner. And this is like, you do so much of drama when we need permission for dharnas and protests, and now you're calling me to go to movie and whatever with you. And then I do not know how to really deal with it. I need to be nice, good. I'm like really freaked out. This is not really something nice I want. I don't want any advances from you. But at the same time, every time do go back there. You know, your jurisdiction, I come into your jurisdiction every time. So I need to be watching over my behavior with him. How do I talk? How do I message? How do I respond? And when I go do the dharna and be in the place, and when he's there around, how do I behave in that particular place and instant is also something that I need to watch over. And that's something I remember vividly. I'll think twice and thrice before even myself showing up at the dharna, I think, because I know this man would be there around. And this, I mean, so that way, the fear is like there, right, constantly. And for that matter, whether in this ropes, there is some sense of fear. Because now suddenly, I think today I remember someone saying, some official apparently told Aadhaar card and voter ID cards are not proofs for citizenship. And all these days I've been flashing my Aadhaar card everywhere in Bodh Gaya, like, oh, this I am citizen of India, this I am citizen of India, and all that. Now I go back, I'm not sure what do I show to say I'm citizen of India. Then the fear, I mean, if the fear you rely on documents, right? And then there's no, of course, one fear there is self-censorship of wanting to subscribe to certain kind of norms because you want to like stay away from that fear. In some sense, be protected from that fear. The way you dress, the places you go, the way we navigate in our public spaces and everything. And then the other immediate reliance is that you rely on documents because these are the ones that also protect you from your fear of trashing your identities in some or the other sense, whatever the limited documentation that you have. So then even that is taken away from you, then where do you rely to, in a sense, what do you do? Where do you confine to get away from this fear? And the self-censorship only gets much more difficult and harder, I think, because these days they're bringing in all the Muslim, some of the Muslim community people saying that, oh, NRC is okay, CAB is okay, and it becomes a double onus on those people to say that they are Indians, that they need to support what government is doing. So the self-censorship becomes much more stronger on people who come from marginalized communities, I think, because they need to do the double effort and double work to prove that they are patriots, they are part of this country, and they are Indians. And the way of doing it is that by completely confining to everything, conforming to every norm, every rule, every regulation, where you do not question, challenge anything whatsoever. And that is what exactly they expect us to do, the system expects us to do. To conform to every rule and regulation without saying anything, without questioning it, challenging it at any level, even trying to think about it. There is no scope of even to think about it. Even before you think, you need to comply to it. And that's a kind of scenario we live in, whether it is in this time or the times before or times later, I think.
So, if I could just kind of add to that, and a kind of what seems to be changed here is that the law then requires compliance, whereas earlier it was based on justice. So then how do you, if the state acts on behalf of you, that's what's happening now. The state is acting for you, you know. So then where is the question of justice sort of emerging in this case?
I think the fundamental difference between looking at this relationship in terms of fear and compliance versus looking at it in terms of justice, right? And I mean, in some abstract sense, the law is supposed to bring justice at the end or ensure a just society, etc. I think the difference between looking at these two is the idea of trust. Justice, I think, comes out of a sense of trust when you're able to treat everybody with respect, right? And that includes the relationship between the state and the citizen, right? So when the state sees a citizen as not a subservient person, but as someone that is to be treated with respect and dignity, that relationship is only possible, I think, when there is a certain element of trust between the state and its citizens. And we, I think, function in a paradigm where that trust is absent. Right. So, and this is true not just of this is true of the NRC and related processes. It's also true, for instance, as others have said, of Aadhaar, where, for instance, I recall Usha Ramanathan saying that Aadhaar as a concept assumes that everybody is a fake, fraud, ghost, whatever other term you want to use. until you authenticate yourself, right? So that fingerprint then becomes, you have to perform something, you have to do a performance in order to authenticate yourself. When that trust itself is absent, I think then then like that relationship itself starts on a very shaky footing, right? And then fear sort of becomes reinforcing at multiple levels. Uh, you as a citizen, because you're afraid, what you're trying to do is gain or regain the state's trust. How do you do that? You do that by submitting documents. How do you obtain those documents? In turn, you have to sort of be subservient to the state so that you have the necessary paperwork in hand, right? So I think it creates that vicious cycle of dependence where then the state uses the law to make up for that absence of trust.
Right. I mean, it's interesting when you speak also about, the idea of trust, because, trust is also something that grows through networks. And it's also part of the community, right? And it's a shared community, it's a shared network, it's a shared sense of storytelling, right? And that's where, so the example which you gave about the cop who was making advances at you, I find that really interesting because there is the fear that you have, but there's also a kind of shame that he is kind of projecting for not being able to then, so fear and shame have these two sort of very, what's the word, close, intimate kind of relationship. But more importantly, when we look at trust, how does the local community then sort of, build, like as an institution, like, and where is that sort of breaking down?
I think it's it's kind of quite challenging. I think even with the close-knit community groups, the aspect of trust is never easier. For example, for whatever the limited experience I have engaging with the Hijra community here and elsewhere, it's a closed group community, right? And it's a close-knit group. But there is always a sense of doubt and suspicion about a new member. A new member who comes or who expresses an interest of joining and becoming part in some or the other way. Or even a new member who doesn't want to become a member but simply just want to become friends with, or just want to, because there is so much of fear. There's so much of fear, and then how do you trust? So what are the mechanisms that you use to establish trust, right? Like as simple as even in the monastic communities that I'm part of, you go to the Mahabari Supa where Buddha got attained enlightenment. We see so many monastics engaging in so many practices. Then there's always a buzz that goes around in the community also, who is really true monastic, who is the part of the community, who is not, because there is also, of course, the other way around, because there is suspicion of that, people are just coming and joining. People are not really part of community then, because there is also norm and standard and how people can become part of community, right? And do they subscribe and fill in to that norm of becoming part of the community? And if they don't, then how can be the part of community? So how do we trust them? And whether it is Hijra community or for that matter even the gay community, or even not even the real community but the virtual community of either Grindr or Planet Romeo or all that, when you see a new fellow, you think twice. Or especially if you're a newbie yourself in the space, you'll think twice how do you establish trust, because there's also shame, right, that you are there. And then the other person, like I remember when we, in the back old days when there were not many dating sites, this was called, there was one dating site where we are all on, I think, and none of you do put your pictures on. Then you're already enough in shame or whatever kind of not so comfort of being in the site place to begin with. And then there's another person that you're trying to communicate with, and the other person asks you, can I see you? Then you're like, you don't want to show yourself first, because what if this person knows you already? And what you're outing to this person, you're because already shameful. And the other person also doesn't want to show himself first. So you first. And this goes on. And how do you establish trust? I don't have an answer to that over there, honestly. How do you really work out saying that, I can put my picture out there first and be okay with it and not be shameful about it, but also have some sense of at least benefit of doubt, if not exactly trust to begin with. And that's always challenging, especially in marginalized communities where you feel you have limited community spaces and where you are constantly feeling threatened by other entities coming and encroaching these community spaces and taking advantage of these spaces. And this keeps happening. It's not that it doesn't happen. So these people and these communities are more careful, certainly, and that also keeps them away from the people in that sense. But it is their, defense mechanism in some sense, or protective mechanism in some sense, to stay as safe as possible in not so safe world. And then you constantly are trying to navigate through trust and shame. There is shame of being part of the community, but there is also the trust you're trying to establish to be able to expand your community, have more members in the community, and make more friendships and relationships. And it is challenging in everyday reality, I think.
I just want to add something, because the idea of shame, stigma, exclusion, and this fear of exclusion, which all of these come from, is also something that is used in our narratives of police, but also in our narratives of criminality and the idea of like being a good citizen, right? So what I started with about fear in the police as children, by the time we were teenagers, and I think when you're a teenager, fear is not an emotion that works very well, especially with regard to people in authority. So then that articulation from the parents and teachers changed from fear, it changed to stigma and shame. You know, like what kind of person, what will people say if you go to the police station? Or if police comes to your house, it's a thing of great shame, it's a thing of great stigma to be seen in any association with the police, right? Because then the implied association with that is criminality, right? And then are you that kind of person who has to go to the police station, or the police comes to your house, that kind of thing. And I just want to quickly think about two things that happened recently. Hyderabad recently was witness to an instance of brutal sexual violence. And the day after this incident was reported and the victim's body was found, a minister from here made a statement in the press, a victim blaming sort of statement, saying before the victim had called her sister a short while before the incident, and there was a recording of that sort of went viral, where she's terrified and she's talking to them. And the minister said, why did she not call the police? Why did she call her sister? Right? I think if the minister had paused a moment to reflect on his own question, he would have probably gotten the answer to that. Some months back, somebody had done a straw poll on Twitter, and it had a few thousand responses. In a case of crisis, who would you call first? And the options were police, your friends, relatives, neighbors, etc. And I think the police had some 10% of responses. Not to say that it was a representative sample, but I think the sentiment essentially is, why do people not call the police? Why is the police not the first people that you think of at a time of crisis, right? And that, I think, a lot of what Tashi has been saying also connects with that. The second thing, very quickly, a few days back, some of us were at India Gate to protest against police violence that had happened at Jamia Millia Islamia University a few days earlier. And that day was December 16th, okay, which was the anniversary of another major incident of sexual violence that happened in Delhi in 2012. And some people, in the gathering, were talking about the irony of how, 7 years ago we were all again here at India Gate protesting against police inaction and how the police don't make this place safe for women when it's their job to do so. And again, yesterday you saw the same police who were supposed to protect women and do and keep us safe in general, are actually going around beating up women students. So yeah, I think the ironies in all of these instances are also very clear.
I think I just wanted to say one single thing. I think the best and the first places or the production houses of fear are families. And that's where fear is generated and produced and nurtured and raised from the beginning to the end, I think, and it continues. And it's also not a fear where you need to be responsible and cautious and thoughtful, mindful and all that, but it is a fear where you need to be frightened, scared, and keep quiet and don't speak much, when not necessary, or step back. It's that kind of fear, and and families continue to produce that kind of fear. Amongst everyone, I think, and more so among women. But yeah, and it's done in every day. And suddenly we expect people not to be fearful is ironical, I think.
I mean, there are these two kind of categories which people have spoken about, and it's also, I find it very kind of relevant here. Is that the idea of the debtor and the idea of the creditor. So every time the debtor has an obligation to the creditor, right? So whenever the patriarchal Brahmanic order is under threat, the debtor becomes the Dalit or the Muslim or the woman, And if you kind of look at the way in which even the whole trauma of partition was played out, right? So partition didn't just create like a separate body, a country, and that body had a name, but that name had to be inscribed on the body of another woman, of a woman, hence another body, right? So that inscription becomes a way of settling a score, The other kind of sort of very interesting thing, which we should wrap up, right? And we can take comments. I won't say questions because, I mean, we're not sort of a panel here, is that this idea of trust, and at what point do we understand, or how is trust actually played out? So the community of artisans I work with, they kind of, they are commissioned by storytellers to make like a scroll, a patam, right? But when the scroll is commissioned, there's no sense of how much is being paid or who is paying, where will the payment be made, right? So it's all very uncharted, all very suspended. But, so when I ask them that, okay, aapko paise kab milenge? They say, pata nahi, jab marzi wo de denge. But then, actually, in practice, it's charted out. So the trust is not something that is already established, it has to be revealed, So what is actually kind of, in theory seems to, in practice seems to be uncharted or suspended or unreliable, in theory it's actually very kind of set. It's very sort of, laid out. Now, the only way in which we have, or the only language that we have to access this is by calling it trust or by calling it or revealing, but we don't know what the language within the practice is, right? So we just like to stop there, and do people have comments on this idea of fear? And yes. Of course, we'll be speaking at law of justice in a legal framework, but I'm just trying to see it, also, if you look at justice and see it as an equitable distribution of resources, or looking at understanding, it's also looking at why are some people more exposed to risk than other people? If we try and address that, isn't that also a notion of justice? I mean, in terms of a legal framework, but in terms of, let's say, economics, right? That why are more people exposed to the idea of fate than few? Why is infrastructure built in such a way that it helps others and not? So why am I more exposed to risk, So if you look at the Bhopal gas tragedy, right? The injustice there is that why were some people exposed to that and not the rest, So that's one way of also looking at the idea of justice, which. Wrap up, but then I would connect your question on surveillance to Sir's question on the issue of trust. So the issue is that whenever the failure of national policy becomes a rationale for surveillance then, right? Because there is this fear propaganda that attacks are random. So surveillance is both participatory, it becomes industrialized, and it becomes interactive, Now surveillance in this case, what also happens, if you look at the Aadhaar card, It is meant for the public distribution system. It's a way of surveillance also. Now, the surveillance or the code, the program, the algorithm is both for welfare, but the program is also for the terrorist. So the poor and the terrorist are kind of dealt with in the same kind of way. So initially, after the French Revolution, you had a lot of the Jews and Protestants were allowed to marry and they had birth certificates by not the church but the municipality. But for this to happen, the municipality then said that we will be able to give you largesse and rights only if we know your numbers. You know? So the poor and the terrorists, in some sense, if you look at the politics of digital India, it's how they come together. You know? The other bit also is that there is the sense that one can emancipate class through citizenship. So in cultural studies, there's this whole idea of repatriation. The museum returns at the artifact of the community. But what's happening in this case, so we are giving you citizenship to those who are within the act, but we don't care about your livelihood. So citizenship becomes a surrogate for employment, for livelihoods, you know. So the state itself is coming out as an object of longing, an object of desire. So that's the sort of, you know, way in which...
I'll be very brief. Questions I think on the law and justice system are like much too large to be answered here, so we can take them. I'm happy to discuss them over lunch or elsewhere. I just want to make one comment, which is that justice is not a legal concept; it's a moral concept. Once I think we have that, once we look beyond, we look at justice, I think, as something that we think as individuals, as a community, is something that produces a fair outcome. And not necessarily look at the law as a solution to that. Then I think that clears up a lot of the rut that we find ourselves stuck in.
Quickly, I think, because we're running short of time, the trust with armed forces and police officers, I don't think they ever actually do want us to trust them. They actually do want us to fear them. And they actually work in that space and in that their entire achievement is to make us fearful, not trusting them. They never expect trust from us. They actually expect fear from us. So can we actually trust someone who expects fear from us? I don't think so, honestly. And at least in the kind of way they are operating right now, no. Coming to Buddhist Sangha and the role of Sangha, either from Buddha's time to now, like generally I lead some of the pilgrimages, people who come on wanting to go on a pilgrims on Buddhist holy sites in Bihar, and one of the places is Nalanda University. And when we go to Nalanda University ruins, the narrative is always about how Bhaktiar Khilji came and demolished and destroyed Nalanda University around 13th century and all that. Often what a lot of people don't point out and talk about is that it is not just Bhaktiar Khilji who destroyed Nalanda ruins, but because the Sangha itself got corrupt, it led to the destruction of the university. So it is also important for Buddhist Sangha to recognize how corrupt we got within ourselves also, as much as we try to play the most liberal, progressive kind of faith, religion and all that, but also we are very much corrupt within, and that also need to be addressed before we think of going ahead and actually socially engaging, I think. And the second one regarding conversions, as simple as that, recently, I think, a few months back, a central government rolled down another rule. Any organization that has FCRA cannot do any religious conversions. Of course, this is largely targeting Christian organizations. Well, ideological conversion or religious conversion in the sense, of course, ideological conversion, in one sense, there are a lot of people who come and are interested in Buddhism wanting to study Buddhism, right? But it is also a new age world where people want to study Buddhism or any other faith in order to have happiness, in order to be mindful. This is all the new age terms that go around, and new age thing that goes around to find happiness, to find mindfulness, all those things. It is not about trying to address the larger issues in the society, I think, because it is that self self-centric world we live in, and that is always the problem. And unless that is addressed, whether you offer them Buddhism, whether you offer them something else, it is always going to be about how can I be happy in my nice bangla car and not to really look at on anything on the street and be okay with it, you know, or even not even have the view at it. So whether you give them Buddhism, whether you give them Hinduism, whether you give them something else, that is what they make out of it. And also, in majority of the world, to one of the statement, one of the person made here is about Dharma and practicing Dharma in that sense. Most of the people, as much as where we stand and see people are operating from selfishness and other kind of hatred and motives, but also a larger part of the society and the kind of violence that is being operated is also operated from the place of love. Similarly, as what families do, they do violence on the name of love. They don't do violence on the name of hate. Hate is something very commonly understood among the larger world. It is bad and you're not supposed to do. So you never say that I hate someone very vocally. You always say to anyone that I love you. That is the reason I ask you not to go out of the home. I love you. That is the reason I ask you to come and do an RC, cab, something. Basically that I'm doing everything because I love this country, because I love the India, I love the Indianness, the language, culture, blah, blah, blah. And I'm doing everything out of love. So the problem is that kind of love, I think, more than hatred. And that love is more dangerous than hatred, which is more direct, vocal, and clear, I think.